Middle Path Radio, your number one online Islamic talk station.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to Straight Talk on Middle Path Radio. I'm your host, Quddus Ali. I hope you are well. It's good to be back after a long break. It feels like it's been a few months, but it's only been about 6 weeks. And alhamdulillah, I hope you are keeping well. Lot of things has happened since my last show before Ramadan. You've had the European Union referendum. You've had the Turkish coup, Dallas attack. Tonight, I wanted to particularly concentrate on the Dallas attack. So this is a conversation for you to call in. And you can text as well on 07477 080248. Remember, this is a show for you, so you please call in and let us have your views. Those of you who have joined the show for the first time, please note that our shows are streamed on a weekly basis, and we have a website which you can visit, and you can go and visit and listen to our shows that were done in the past. There's a variety of shows that we've done in the past, so you can visit our website to listen to those shows, inshallah. Tonight, as I said, we'll be discussing the Dallas attack. You'll see that the recent attack resulted in the killing of a black young man, Micah Johnson, by the police, which sparked protest and civil unrest in several American cities. The deaths of Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Walter Scott, and Freddie Gray are some of the evidence of long-standing problem with police racism and excessive violence. It is no surprise that the hashtag Black Lives Matter became viral in US and across Britain in social media. There were many demonstrations against police brutality in USA, and in solidarity, black people in Britain also came out in the streets of Manchester, Birmingham and London in support of black lives and to campaign for their rights. Living in 2016, we still see a very divisive US. Despite democracy, freedom of speech and equal opportunities, we see hate crime towards black people is worse than the 50s and the 60s during the time of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Why do black people feel that they have been subject to inhumane and degrading treatment at the hands of the police in US? To discuss this and to shed some light on this matter, I have two of my regular guests in the studio. Mashallah, I don't need to give introduction because they have been in the shows before, and mashallah, their shows have hit 5,000 hits, alhamdulillah. For those of you who have joined the show for the first time, I will just briefly introduce my guests to you, inshallah. So I have brother Shahadat Uddin. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Privileged to be back on the show, inshallah.
Barakallah fiqh. And I have Samad Hussain.
Assalamu alaikum.
Jazakallah khair once again.
Barakallah fiqh.
So I will start with brother Shahadat. Can you explain how and why the recent terrible events in Dallas took place?
Sure. Assalamu alaikum. So,
assalam.
On the 7th of July last month in Dallas, Black Lives Matter actually organised a protest or a rally against the recent killings that took place in the days preceding the event itself. And subsequently in that event, unfortunately, 5 police officers lost their lives, and I think around about 12 people were also wounded and injured. And you know, unfortunately, those particular killings were in retribution for the killings that occurred in the days previous with Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge and Philando Castile in Falcon Heights, I believe. So if anybody's actually sort of read about those two incidents or actually seen the videos which have gone viral all over the world, the actual incidents themselves are quite shocking. So in the first one, I'm just going to describe them briefly. You had this black gentleman by the name of Alton Sterling, who was in a car park, and he was pinned to the floor. He had his back to the floor, and the two police officers were incapacitating him. So one of them sat on his chest and the other one sat on his legs to ensure that he couldn't move. And one of the police officers shouted out that he's carrying a gun. Now in the video itself, you can't actually see whether or not he has a gun and whether or not he was actually reaching for it. But what you do see is that, you know, within a few seconds of the actual statement being made, that they discharged the police officers discharged their weapons into either the chest or the head of this particular gentleman, and subsequently he was killed. Now before that video had a chance to actually go viral and for the people to really digest that particular incident, the following day there was an even more outrageous incident in which a gentleman by the name of Philando Castile, who was travelling in his car with his family, so he had his girlfriend in the passenger seat and his 4-year-old daughter in the back, and a police car basically pulled him over because he had a broken tail light.
Again, this gentleman was black, yeah?
He was black, yes.
Yeah.
So they pulled him over because he had a broken tail light. So the police officer in question approached the car and then requested to see the gentleman's driving license. And subsequently, what basically happened was that Philando Castile basically just in a calm manner explained that, look, I do have my driving license. I'm going to present it to you, but I'm just going to warn you that I'm also carrying an arm as well, which I have a license for. So he had a weapon in his possession. But he wanted to warn the police officer that he had one so that he wouldn't get agitated or nervous. And the police officer basically just heard the term, I've got a weapon, and then all of a sudden he got worked up into a panic. And as this gentleman was reaching for his driving license, the officer discharged his weapon, shot him a number of times, and he lay on the driver's seat bleeding to death while his 4-year-old daughter was in the back and his partner was in the passenger seat recording and providing commentary on the incident that occurred. So, you know, as you kind of mentioned in your introduction, that it's shocking that we're in 2016 and you have people that are getting shot for having a broken tail light, which in essence, what happened with this gentleman, he had no, you know, sort of previous record of crimes, and he had a respectable job. You know, he was an upstanding member of the society, and unfortunately he was killed by.
I mean, the point that I would add is that these sort of incidents, they're you know, nowadays everybody's carrying a mobile phone and so on and so forth, and you have the social media and things like this. But otherwise, think about it. Otherwise, you know, there could be hundreds and hundreds of other incidents that are completely, you know, unknown to the public. Yeah, and so it's only nowadays that these sort of things are coming out.
Yeah, it's very interesting you mentioned that, because some black people these are people in America who were asking police to provide statistics on this, and they said, you know, in terms of how many black arrests, and etc. But they said they have no statistics of that sort. And you know, these days you can get statistics on how many people attend movies and how many people read books, etc. But when it comes to black people, but they don't hold statistics. That was my reading on the subject.
Let me tell you the statistics for just New York City, for example. 88% of stopping, you know, cars by the police is for black people. 88%.
Subhanallah, that's very
compared
shocking.
To only just 12%
of their
12% of white. And if you go by the population, you know, the population of the black people is far less than the whites. So you can imagine, you know, a situation where, you know, the minorities are being stopped 88% of the times, and not only that, and most of these stopping, it actually results in arrest and other things, you know. So
Jazakallah khair. How come, you know, black people feel, you know, obviously as we've seen, is the hashtag Black Lives Matter went viral, and people must have felt. It only goes viral when people feel upset, they're concerned. Why are there so much prejudices, racism, and discrimination amongst black people? I mean, it's quite apparent that they feel that way. How come the black people feel in this manner?
I think why the black people feel discriminated is because they are. You know, as you know, we mentioned some statistics just now, and when you look at the statistics themselves, they're actually quite shocking. So a black person is 2.5 times more likely to be shot than his white counterpart. A black armed man is 5 times more likely to be shot than a white armed man. So in terms of just in terms of shootings and killings, it's absolutely inconceivable. But even when you look at supporting statistics like, you know, the sort of population of non-white in the US is around about 30%, so 70% is white. But then when you look at the prison population, 60% of the prison population is non-white. So it comes from the black community, the Latino community, and so on and so forth. When you look at incidents related to drugs, so in terms of the number of people that are involved in sort of drug incidents, is only 14% are actually black. But in terms of the number of people that are arrested, it's 37%. So what you find is that the way in which the blacks are treated in relation to their white counterparts is completely disproportionate.
Is it because of integration? Black people, do they have a problem integrating with white people in US? Is this an integration problem?
See, I don't know if it's so much an integration problem rather than a perception problem. I mean, I think a good analogy is really the Muslim community in Britain.
Yeah, exactly, because they say we don't integrate
we don't integrate, and that ultimately we carry different values which don't allow us to integrate, and so on and so forth. But in reality, it's not so much so that the Muslims don't want to integrate or the blacks don't want to integrate. It's the perception problem that exists within the wider community regarding the black population, and ultimately that's what determines the way that they interact with the black community, and the same goes for the police officers as well.
But I mean, without sounding racist, I wanted to say to ask Abdus Samad, do you think black people have a problem of being violent than the white counterparts, and they carry more guns, and because of that, obviously, our police argue that, look, we need to clamp down on these individuals. Is that
that's absolutely not true? Actually, you know, people carrying guns. I mean, there are plenty of white people, you know, and more so in numbers. And
but there's more criminals amongst black people usually, is it? And because of that,
I don't think that is actually true. Even though the media and the whole perception, like Brother Shahadat is saying, this is the sort of perception that has been created. You know, where black people are more likely to get arrested and to be put behind bars and things like this. You know, and not so much the white people. And that's the reality. Yeah. So in terms of crime, I don't believe that black people are more criminal or have a problem as such, which is specifically to their community or color. But what I would say is that there is definitely a situation that has been created through the you know, isolation and you know, the what do you call, you know, the fact that they have lack of opportunities, you know, which is again, it's a systemic problem, because, you know, the system actually creates a situation by which where a black person is less likely to make it through education and get a decent job and things like this. So that could have an effect, you know. But other than that, I mean, there's plenty of white criminals as well as, you know.
Yeah, because the police argue that, look, they, you know, in order to maintain rule of law, we need to implement, and they sometimes perceive white people as a threat. Black people as a threat in comparison to the white people. You see, otherwise, because they always have a reason. Yeah. You see. I mean, how would you, do you think, in fairness to the police authorities?
Yeah, you know, look, in terms of, and I actually do have some sympathy for the police in this regard, actually, because the problem for them isn't so much so the individuals in question, because, you know, the second incident that I narrated, apparently the officer in question wasn't even white. He was an Asian.
You see.
And there's been previous cases in the past where you've had black police officers that have shot black people. So that in itself tells you that it's more to do with really the instructions that are coming from above. That ultimately what's happening is that because of the perception problem that exists with regards to the black community, with regards to the Latino community, that's resulting in racial stereotyping and racial profiling of these people, and that is then being cascaded and fed down to the police officers who are basically told, look, when you come across somebody of this persuasion, this background, the likelihood is that they're going to be like this, or they're going to be carrying arms, they're going to be aggressive towards you, and that this is the way that you need to handle the situation.
You talk about profiling. Who is profiling them? I mean, where is this coming from?
Well, you know,
When you say, is this from the people on the top?
Absolutely. You've got to remember that ultimately the law enforcement agencies, they're government bodies, they're state institutions.
Absolutely.
Now, they're
there to protect everyone.
They're there to protect everyone, absolutely.
Black people.
But the thing is, when they go out there to protect everybody, it's not in a haphazard way. It's a very planned, meticulously planned way, where they will know which areas are likely to be crime hotspots, which areas are likely to have certain criminal activity taking place, certain gangs that are operating there. So they have an excellent bird's eye view of the whole sort of locale in that respect. And part of that is you've got to have a profile of the type of people that you're going to come across in your day-to-day runnings with people.
Jazakallah khair. The killing in Dallas, was it just an extraordinary isolated event, or is there a history of discrimination and unfair treatment of black people? Can I ask Samad?
To look into this issue? This is actually a very broad question. I think to understand this whole situation in the US at the moment, we have to actually go back to the history and the founding of United States. In my understanding, United States was actually a colonial project, if you like, of the Europeans. The moment they entered into the United States, what have they done? They've annihilated the indigenous American, the Red Indians, and from there on, once they've taken control of the vast territories of land, they needed labor, they needed manpower. So what did they do? They brought in the black people, kidnapped the black people from Africa, shipped them over as slaves to do the labor. This is what they needed. So they brought these people in, and from there on, you can see, this is, so there's a historical difference between the white America and the black America. Do you understand? All right. So where you have the victors who are setting up the whole establishment, the institutions, the laws, the governance, whereas the black counterpart, they're the victims, if you like. So.
But hasn't that changed now? Do you not think? That was history, but some will argue things have improved. Would you?
Things have changed. Now, here's the question: the way things have changed. Was it a common agreement that has been made and between the black and the white to really come together on this new America, or has it always been the whites, having their ways? And the black people are made to be a part of this system that has been designed and laid out, if you like, for the black people. So in that sense, they're not on equal terms and equal footing. Do you understand? So this thing is going to always have an effect on how the two different, communities actually live together and integrate.
Jazakallah khair. Brother Shahadat,
sure.
Just want to add
the incident in Dallas specifically, where you had 5 police officers killed, I think that's a pretty sort of recent phenomenon. I can't think of many sort of similar incidences. But in terms of obviously the events that led up to the incidents in Dallas, where you've had black people that have been killed under very dubious circumstances by police officers in the US is pretty commonplace, and they have been, to be honest, over the last couple of years. So those 2 incidents alone, they were the 135th and 136th incident of a black person being killed by police officers in this year alone. And really, in terms of this particular sort of phenomena, it really goes back to around about August 2014 with the Ferguson riots, where you had a similar incident where a young black youth, Michael Brown, 18 years of age, who again killed under dubious circumstances by a white police officer by the name of, I think, Darren Darren Wilson. And that basically just kicked off a series of riots in that particular locality where for over 2 weeks, I think it was about 2 weeks and 2 days, where Ferguson just turned into a complete war zone where members of the black community were confronting the local police officers, and there was all sorts of chaos that was reigning. And subsequently what happened was that a couple of months later, the police officer in question, Darren Wilson, wasn't found guilty of any wrongdoing, and that triggered off another set of riots. And really, from that incident, you've pretty much had these types of incidents occur on a regular basis.
This goes to show it's not just the police, isn't it? It's actually the whole establishment.
Is that the reason why you had Martin Luther King, his dream? Now people say that dream has become a nightmare. And Mr. Malcolm X as well. I mean, from the days of Malcolm X and now, do you see there's a lot of difference? Because if slavery was a long time ago.
Yeah, but
Malcolm X's time.
What we're talking about is the slavery period, all right? That ended not because the establishment felt sort of that it
needs to change. The
establishment needs to change,
and we need to protect the black
realization people. of equality in human beings and things like this. No, when America was actually fighting for independence, they weren't considering the black people. They weren't considering the fact that they have so many slaves that need to be freed. They were actually talking about their own independence from the colonial Britain. You see, so we hear, and this is where this whole Constitution of America and the Declaration of Independence and all these things, but that wasn't really necessarily talking about the black people at all. But as a result, so these things were a good thing, because as a result, this actually then paved the way, if you like, for the black people to rise up and then take that opportunity as well. Do you see? So this is what I'm saying. For the black people, it's always been, a struggle against the system. But it's always been a struggle against the system, and this is exactly what we're seeing today: a struggle against the system. Surely, a system that you have to struggle against in order to secure your basic humanity is a wrong system. There's a problem with that system itself. And what I am saying is that anybody who actually would suggest that America is a model of any sort for any other people to follow is actually,
because they go around exporting democracy, freedom in Muslim countries, for example, and they're beacon of democracy.
Yes, but there is to be fair. Is like there is also this argument that it's a work in progress.
Yeah, because they have a black president, Mr. Obama.
But how would you counter that? But the very foundation upon which America was built is actually flawed. And this is what I'm saying, it is actually flawed. And this is why we're seeing all these things that we're seeing today.
So essentially what you're saying is that it was based on protecting white people. Yeah, the entire system was...
Again, I wouldn't say white as such, because, when we're talking about the colonial project, there was there was an underclass of even white people, do you see, that were subject to economic exploitation and so on and so forth. Do you see? Now, in the beginning, at the time of slavery, there were actually an underclass of white people who had, a similar situation as the black people. But what happened? They realized, those people, the capitalists, those people who were exploiting the black and the white people at that time, realized that because initially there was an uprising between, from those underclass white people and the black people together against the establishment. But what the establishment then realized, i.e. the capitalists who were in charge of the system and the governance and the order, they realized that they need to actually divide the black people from the white people in order to sort of control the situation. So what happened? The white people at that time, they were given certain privileges, better treatment, and they were in a fixed period term of labor, and after that they became free, whereas the black people weren't. And what that done is actually separated the black people from the white people. Now this is the point. The point is, at the heart of it is actually a capitalist, colonialist mindset, all right, that is at work. and they are the ones that are constantly creating these artificial divisions between different races, different colors, different religion, different localities. And it's because that's how they can divide and they can exploit the whole situation for their capitalist interests. And this is exactly the same policies that have been exported out into the Middle East and other parts of the world.
Jazakallah khair. You can call in on 07477 080248. We're having a very interesting discussion tonight. In case you've just joined us, it's hashtag Black Lives Matter. So please call in and let us have your say on this issue. You can also text us with your question or comments and let us know how you think about the discussion we are having now. Brother Shahadat, despite race relations laws, how and why do we see racism, discrimination and prejudices still existing in USA and other countries? You know, you have a very tough race relation laws in America and even in this country, in Britain. So despite all of that, why?
That's absolutely correct. I mean, look, in terms of when you've got a problem, problem like racism, like prejudice that exists in any country, you're not going to be able to solve them by legislation alone. Ultimately, it's what you've got to deal with. You've got to deal with the philosophy, with the mindset of people. But what I want to do, I actually want to draw an analogy between the black community in the US and the Muslim community in this country. So what we had 10 years ago in 2006, the Labour government actually enacted a piece of legislation known as the Race and Religious incitement to violence law, where basically it became illegal for people to express their views that potentially could be inflammatory, which could lead to other people acting on those views that have been expressed. So somebody looking at that particular piece of legislation would think that that's a pretty good piece of legislation. It's designed to protect the minority ethnic groups and the minority religious groups as well. But what have we seen subsequently in the last 10 years? We've seen the rise of Islamophobia. Last year alone, I think the statistic was that there was a 70% increase in Islamophobia in this country on the previous
That's
year.
right.
So despite these forms of legislation being enacted, it's not really made any difference. And now the question really turns to, so why is it that things like Islamophobia or racism is on the rise now? And that really comes back down to the government and the state themselves, because in effect what they're doing is, through their denigration of Islam, through their harassment of the Muslim community by saying that Islam is a backward religion, that it breeds terrorism, it breeds extremism and radicalism, and ultimately Muslims are baying for the blood of all Europeans and Westerners. In effect, the state is actually inciting the people to violence and hatred themselves. So really, they should be arresting themselves, because ultimately it really comes back down to perception again. We talked about perception. It's the perception that people have of another group which leads them to actually, specific types of behavior and actions. Now, the problem is in this country, the Muslims are only 3 million and the wider population is 60 million. 3 million people are not going to be able to dispel the myths and the lies that are being spread by the state. And it's a similar situation in the US. So with the US, the black community are in an extremely difficult position because of the environment they find themselves in, the social, economic deprivation they find themselves in. The opportunities that exist for black youths aren't the same as those for the white youths. So invariably what ends up happening is that they end up being forced into a life of crime, which is why you've got all of these disproportionately high statistics. And because they end up being pushed into a life of crime, then you've got to have the police force that deals with those issues, and they end up having to racially profile people, and then they have to devise methodologies and ways of handling specific individual groups. So in essence, the black community, they're in this vicious cycle. Now, who's to blame for that situation? It's the state fundamentally, because one, they've marginalized these communities, they've ignored these communities. So if there's social deprivation in black areas, why aren't you dealing with those issues? Why aren't you investing more money? Why aren't you creating jobs? Why aren't you why aren't you making education more viable for the black youth? Because ultimately they're going through high school and then it stops for them. They can't go into college, they can't go into university because of lack of funding. Fundamentally, there's a failure on the part of the state to deal with these fundamental issues, and so it perpetuates the situation. The environment doesn't change. The black youth are led into a life of crime, and the police have to deal with that.
Yeah, but I mean, all of these things. I mean, you can trace the roots of all of these things even 300 years back. What I'm saying is here, like we talk about, the abolition of the of slavery, but that was actually consequential rather than realizing somehow that there's something wrong with slavery. You see, it was consequential because of the political circumstances and situations. So whatever the blacks are afforded has always been, a type of political expediency. We only give them whatever rights if we have to. Otherwise, we don't even entertain that.
I've got a question from Abdullah. He's saying, will life be better for black people if Donald Trump win American election for presidency? He doesn't want the Muslims to go.
Yeah, short answer is no. Answer is no. I think Donald Trump, he represents a very sort of old school right-wing Republican sort of ideology, and he's very much about American interests, about white interests, and as you've already mentioned, he wants to put a stop to Muslims even coming into the US. So I don't think it's going to make any difference whatsoever.
Jazakallah khair. I've got a question from Musa, is for Samad. He's saying, what was the difference between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King? What was their message? Are they not both black? I mean, why is Musa asking this question?
No, I think that's a very interesting question. Actually,
Right,
a very important question.
Why do you say that?
Because what we found is that obviously, we find both groups of people that were trying to represent the black people and their interests, but they were very different in nature in terms of the approach that they were taking. What we found with Martin Luther was that he was actually pro-establishment, and he believed in the establishment, and he believed that it's through the establishment that the rights of the blacks will be secured through applying more pressure onto the establishment to give the blacks more recognition and so on and so forth. Whereas Malcolm X's camp, if you like, Nation of Islam, initially,
that's right, yeah.
They realized early on, if you like, that this establishment is not for us. It wasn't designed for us, and it can never represent us. Do you see? So in that situation, what we found is that the establishment had actually embraced Martin Luther, because that was obviously the more sort of like, favorable for the establishment. Whereas if they had to give anything, they'd rather give what Martin Luther was asking for, because that would actually, bring the black community under their sort of like control. Whereas Malcolm X was asking for complete independence from the white establishment. Do you see? Which is something that the white establishment wasn't willing to do. Do you see? And actually, this is something that we need to actually reflect upon even here in the UK. What we can see is that you will always find the establishment will favor certain groups of Muslims against other groups of Muslims. Do you see? So the pro-establishment Muslims are accommodated, facilitated, whereas groups that might criticize the establishment, the laws, the systems, the governance, you'll find that these groups of people will be marginalized, sidelined. And that's exactly the same approach that had been taken by the American establishment at that time. But the reason for, in my understanding, the reason for Martin Luther's success is that the Malcolm X camp existed. Do you see? Because that's the only thing that made the white establishment, see that, hold on a minute, we need this guy if we want to bring, control the black communities. If we want to bring these people under
so
our,
he was their client effectively.
In that sense, maybe not directly, but indirectly, that's how it has been.
Brother Shadat, do you want to come into that one?
Yeah, I mean,
To
to be honest, I think Abdul Samad has really explained it really well. I mean, I think what's interesting with Malcolm X is that towards the end of his life, he actually changed his stance quite a bit. So I think it was Malcolm X that initially said that the white man is the devil.
That's right.
I'm
Yeah, Elijah Muhammad's group. Yeah.
So for him, you know, there was no possibility of white and black people coexisting together. It's just not possible because of the view that he had towards white people fundamentally. And ironically, it was only after he was able to leave the bubble that was the US, and I think when he went on Hajj in the early 70s, and he was taken aback by what he actually saw in Mecca when he was performing pilgrimage there, where he saw, you know, whites, blacks, he saw Asians all coming together under the umbrella of Islam, where he saw genuine brotherhood, love, respect, all of these things. And fundamentally that changed his perception, is that word again, perception, of race relations, to the point that he actually, I think he wrote back to his wife in the US, and he fundamentally he changed his position on the whole thing, and he said that, look, absolutely, I was wrong. You know, relationships can improve between whites and blacks.
Jazakallah khair. I've got another text from one of our listeners. He's saying there are many black Muslims that are also affected by the institutionalized racism here and abroad in America. But how can Muslims over here on this side, if the pond help the cause, what should we take part in, demos, etc.? Abdus Samad?
Sorry, I didn't understand that question, sorry.
Yeah, I think what he means is that, you know, following on from your comment on Martin Luther King, that he's trying to say, should black Muslims here and in America, how should they protect their interests? Should they participate in demonstrations, in campaigning, lobbying the government to seek and protect their rights?
Yeah, I think the whole Malcolm X issue is very interesting, and like Brother Shahad had mentioned towards the later part of his activism, he changed his views. But
I think what he's trying to say is coexist. Can they coexist? I mean, what can they do to coexist and to assimilate, if there's a way of assimilating with black people?
You know, in my understanding, the way things are at the moment, the establishment, it's impossible, because there will always be this segregation. There will always be this minorities.
This complex.
This whole concept of minorities and the differences and things like that. These things will exist, and the fact that the black people, their history, their oppression that they have suffered at the hands of the white people, and when Brother Shahad was talking about how Malcolm X took the view that the white people were the devils and so on and so forth. That's actually that was a very reactionary response, if you like, from the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X, because that was the exact philosophy, if you like, of their white counterparts, where they believed that they were the superior race, and the black people were the inferior race. And God has chosen the white people over the black people, and the black people, rightfully should be serving as slaves to the white people. You'd be surprised, but that view is even today held by a lot of Americans. The white supremacist movements.
And what about here in this country? Do you think similar views are held by?
I think here it's a lot more subtle. Maybe I don't know. Maybe we don't hear.
Yeah, because the listeners might think that you're being very cynical. You're drawing a cynical picture of America when you have an American president who is black, isn't it, Mr. Barack Obama? So do you see? So they've gone really. Moved on. Things have progressed really, really, well in terms of giving rights to black people, isn't it? They've moved on.
I don't think the situation has changed. I mean, even Barack Obama, he's facing a lot of racist sort of like response from the wider society. I don't think it's, and the fact is, in my understanding, yeah, even Barack Obama is just a puppet, really. You know, I don't believe that he actually holds much power. You know, even though he may be the president of the United States, I actually sincerely don't believe that he holds much power at all. Right. Rather, again, I think it was a type of political expediency in the situation where, you know, like America had to show that it's moving on and it's now it has a black president and so on and so forth.
Because my initial point was on race relations, you know, race relation laws actually, and especially in Britain, you have very robust race relations laws, Race Relations Act, for example, and Discrimination Act, which makes it illegal for people, for especially employers and institutions, to discriminate on the grounds of color or race, basically. So, I mean, do you think does it work? Does it really work?
Well, it's clearly not working, isn't it? This is the point. It's clearly not working. I mean, you can have robust laws, but unless you really have a foundation upon which these things are completely dissolved, you know, and this is where we have to actually look at Islam, you know, like, because it's the culture upon which you actually set up and establish a society. Now, once the culture is there, then you can have a system, because a system is slightly separate from the culture. Now, the culture of the American society is based on race. It is looking at, you know, people through the lens of race, color, and so on and so forth. Do you see? Whereas in Islam, you find that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you know, from day one, he made it very clear that you know, an Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, and neither the non-Arab has superiority over the Arab, and there's no discrimination of the white people over the black and the black over the white. So you can see he was actually challenging the whole philosophy about humanity before he actually brought about a system. And this cannot be said about America. And this is why I keep going back to the history of America, because you have to actually look at the history to really understand where it's coming from.
I've got a question for Shahadat. Saying I think it's bigger than just white versus black. With Britain and its close relationship with the USA, will our new Prime Minister take any lessons from and would be hopeful President Donald Trump? As a white Muslim revert, I don't feel UK is my home no more. My question is, where is my home? We might tackle it at the end, but briefly, this brother's concerns about his home.
Yeah, I think for Muslims specifically at the moment, it's a very, very difficult time that we ourselves are in. And as I said, I think it's a good parallel between the Muslim community here and in Europe and the black community in the US, that ultimately, look, it's state policy which is driving the Islamophobia. You know, the point that I made before, that on one hand, they're saying that, look, this issue of racism and religious discrimination is a bad thing because they've enacted some laws. But with the other hand, they're actually fueling the fire. And they're creating these negative perceptions of Muslims in, you know, just generally all over the world, that ultimately they're all hell bent on, on killing innocent people and sort of making the world burn, when the truth couldn't be further from it. So, you know, I think it's understandable that in the comment that the brother's actually made, that he's genuinely worried for his future, and that, you know, I think there's a lot of similarities between sort of Nazi Germany and how the Jews were treated in Nazi Germany and the situation that the Muslims find themselves in Europe today, that ultimately it's not going to take much for the situation to really get out of hand, where ultimately the indigenous population end up turning on the Muslims, fundamentally because you've got these elites at the top that are trying to incite that violence and
Jazakallah khair. Interesting.
So actually, I didn't
brother.
quite answer that question that came in your text. So, in my understanding, the approach that Malcolm X was taking towards the whole towards the establishment was actually correct, though his philosophy about the race was incorrect initially. But later on, he did realize that, you know,
after he went to
Hajj, and he realized that Islam had actually an answer to this whole problem Do you see? And this is where, you know, like there's no issue of race and no issue of color. Rather, it's this whole philosophy, you know.
Which brings me to this point. Do you want to carry on?
No,
Very
what I
briefly.
wanted to say is that we should not we shouldn't participate in this system, knowing full well that it is not designed to truly represent all people, you know, at the same time. Do you see? So, and this is why I say that Malcolm X's approach, where he realized very early on that this establishment is not for the black people, and 60 years on, 70 years on, we can see this is how it is, isn't it? It's not representing the black people. The black people are always fighting this uphill battle against the establishment to secure their basic rights. Surely that's a failed system. It's a system that isn't working. It's not representative. So shouldn't we look for the alternative system that can actually truly represent people of different race, different color, different creed? And do we not have example of this in the history? And that's something maybe we'd like to look into.
Which brings me to the interesting point that, you know, nationalism. I'm not too sure whether nationalism is an ideology, but even black people bonding together. Bangladeshi people bonding together, white people bonding together, Arabs bonding together. Can we ever bond in this manner? And how subsisting, how perpetual is that sort of bonding? And can that ever eradicate racism and prejudices from society? You know, bonding. You know, white people bond, black people bond, Bangladeshis bond. This bonding, being patriotic about your country. Football, for example, you have Wales and England, etc.
It's a good question that you ask, actually. See, what you find, things like nationalism and racism, they're just artificial constructs. They're human constructs, and anything that is artificially constructed can also be deconstructed. You can undo it. Now, you need to understand, to begin with, the history behind why nation states themselves emerged and why nationalism emerged itself. And really, it ties back to the historical points that Brother Abdul Samad was making earlier about America being the colonial project. That fundamentally what you had was this imperialistic capitalist class that had a desire predominantly from Europe to go all over the world, colonize the world, subject the people, steal the resources, and just really implement an oppressive system. But fundamentally, for them to be able to spread the imperialistic colonialist system, they needed their own people on board. Because it's not going to be the capitalist classes that physically go over to these lands and colonize it themselves. They need their people on board. And fundamentally, that's why they had to create the nation state. That's why they had to create nationalism, this sense that us as a nation, that us as a white race, that us as the British people, we're superior to the Indians, we're superior to the Africans. It is our burden, it is our duty to go over to these places to in effect take these barbaric people and implement a civilized system over them. So even as I said, the issue of nationalism and the issue of racism, they were only ever imperialistic tools. They were only ever a means to an end in order to get their own people on side, so this imperialistic system could be spread. Now, the one of the best evidences of this, if we look at the end of World War II, with the end of the formal end of colonialism, where the greatest colonial empire, Britain, ultimately it was dissolved. The British Empire was dissolved. The state of Britain was in a very bad way. The population was greatly diminished because of the two wars before it. And when they wanted to sort of put in place a recovery strategy, what did they end up doing? They ended up opening up their borders, didn't they? They ended up opening up the borders, allowing people of different ethnicities, races, religions to flood in from different parts of the world, mainly the Commonwealth countries. So they came in from the Indian subcontinent, they came from Africa, they came from the West Indies, in order to rebuild the country. So where did British nationalism go then? Where did this idea that the white man is superior to the black man or to the Asian man go then? because fundamentally it's not really about color for them. It's fundamentally it's about dominating over people. It's about implementing the imperialistic colonialist system. Now this really, I just want to quickly take it back to sort of the situation that we find ourselves in at the moment, that ultimately one of the main strategies that the imperialist has at his disposal is divide and conquer. So if you look at their foreign policy, this was primarily the principle upon which their foreign policy was based. But even domestically, they implement this particular strategy. So if you look at this country, you've got the Muslims who are being harassed. You've got the continental Europeans that are being harassed now in the aftermath of Brexit.
Absolutely, Romanians,
you know,
Polish people.
It's the indigenous population. Look,
it's gone up by 70%. Hate crime.
Go home now. If it's not them, it's the people, the benefit claimants. It's the single mothers. This is
constant scapegoat.
It's constantly searching for a scapegoat, somebody that you can pin the blame on. And the whole point is that, you know, what they want to do, they want to basically pit different sections of the population against one another, because ultimately they're so preoccupied with their own conflicts, with their own sort of disagreements and their own sort of prejudices towards one another, that they take their eyes off the real problems, which are ultimately the ruling classes. So.
And this was very much actually manifested very clearly with the in America. They had the 99% versus the 1%. that campaign actually really, you know, highlighted the true nature of the entire American system, if you like. Yeah. You know, where it's actually the capitalists who are manipulating the people, dividing the communities, sectioning out different parts of the society in order for their capitalist gains, you know, but at the same time, you know, like they're feeding like this whole concept of nationalism.
Even in practice, from my experiences, I've seen this is short-lived, very short-term, superficial bonding. If you look at Bangladesh, Pakistanis, for example, you have the Lahoris and the Islamabad, they don't like Karachi. In Bangladesh, for example, Siletis don't like Dhaka and Dhaka from Sylhet. So where's the bonding gone then? You see, because if you're patriotic, you see, so I mean, in terms of practically, is it possible? Because that was my initial question, which brother highlighted. But do you think practically, is this something that we should, black people should call for as advice to black people, the nationalism, because they've united on this nationalism, isn't it? I mean, this is why you've had demonstration in this country. I mean, is there briefly any advice to them on this issue of bonding?
Obviously, my advice to them would be to really look into Islam, because Islam clearly has an answer. Islam has demonstrated its ability to really bring different communities, different people of different background. Now you had the Islamic State that spread from the Middle East to East Asia, South Asia, you know, to Africa, you know, parts of Europe. I mean, all these people lived together without this whole issue about race and people of different religions as well, people of different creed. You know,
Jazakallah khair. I'm very tight with time here. Very quickly, brother, there's a question from Taha Hussein. Since the abolishment of the slavery in America, do you think that black people have made any significant changes to their lives? Sure. Very quickly.
Very quickly. You know, I mean, I think it's important that we do add some balance to this discussion. It's very easy to just
that's right.
beat up on the US and
please go ahead.
What I'd like to make, as I said, I think we need to differentiate between the ordinary people and the state itself, because fundamentally, I think the ordinary people have come on made phenomenal progress. I mean, I think in terms of, you know, as you said, you gave the example that Barack Obama is the first black president of the US. It was the people that voted him in. So the American people have shown that they are capable of looking beyond superficial issues like the color of somebody's skin and look at more fundamental issues like, you know, character and personality and whether or not you're capable of doing the job in question. So I think from that perspective, it's important that we make that distinction. I think the ordinary people, to be honest, white, black, we're all victims. We're all victims of this vicious game that is being played by the people that are residing over us, that, as I said before, that are trying to pit us, you know, one against the other so that they can maintain control over us.
Jazakallah khair. The last point was a text I received from one of the listeners, very important text. He's saying, how can we establish fairness and justice and equal opportunities under an Islamic society, given that you have the Sunni-Shia divide? So if you can tackle on in terms of how Islam will deal with and how can we solve this division of Sunni Shia, because that's a very important point.
What I would say briefly, I don't know, Brother Shahadat may want to add some stuff to that. The point is, the Shia-Sunni divide existed from day one, very early on in Islamic history. And Shia Sunnis coexisted.
But before that, can you just quickly deal with how would Islam can Islam eradicate effectively this kind of discrimination and prejudices from society, and how would it do that? And then you can.
I mean, these are differences. These are differences, and differences have always existed. If non-Muslims, if Jews and Christians can live with Islam under the Islamic authority, then why shouldn't Shias be able to live under?
And when was that?
When
when they were living under Islam, when was that? Are you talking about what period was it?
Are we talking about the Shias here?
No, the Islamic system.
Well, if you look at like Spain was ruled by Islam
in the 17th century,
for 700 years, for 7 centuries.
Yeah.
All right, and that was the golden era, if you like, of Islam and Spain itself. Do you see where the Christians, the Jews flourished? Everything went well. As soon as the Christians took over, we found the Spanish Inquisition, isn't it, which we refer to, where the Jews had to flee. They had to leave, and where did they end up? They ended up in Turkey, the Ottoman Empire. Do you see? Because they felt secure, they felt looked after, they felt that they weren't discriminated against under the authority of Islam. And this is what we're saying: Islam can deliver all this again. And it's only when the Islamic State returns, inshallah, this is when the whole world will be able to see and recognize how, the injustice of what we see, in places like America at the moment. That they will be able to see a true model for, human societies,
Because Islam, just when Brother Shahid, Islam's got an intellectual aqidah, isn't it? It's not based on short-lived, superficial nationalism. If you can elaborate on that briefly.
No, absolutely. So really, there's two elements to this. There's a philosophical element, as you've kind of mentioned. There's a practical element. So when you look at the philosophical element, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Hujurat, I think either verse 13 or 14, when he talks about that Allah has created us in nations and tribes in order so that we can know one another. And in essence, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't turn around and say that He created us in nations and tribes so we can be divided, that we can be warring in conflict, that we can live in fear and trepidation. He's saying so that we can know each other, meaning that, look, the issue of difference is supposed to be something,
a blessing.
Is a blessing. It's something that should make us happy, that we look at the differences and we think, subhanallah, how great God is, that he's been able to create such diversity and such variety in the world. This predominantly because let's be honest, if in the world everybody looked the same, spoke the same, acted the same, what a boring world we'd live in.
Very boring world.
So it's an issue that should be celebrated.
Absolutely.
It's not something that should be seen as a divisive issue. And just to go into
even the Shia can live under the Khilafah. There's not going to be a problem.
Of course they can. And the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he showed us how to do it. So if we look at the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Brother Abdul Samad already mentioned the last sermon in which Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam spoke about the Arab not being superior to the non-Arab and the white man not being superior to the black man. But also in his prophethood, what did you see? Ultimately, he spent 23 years trying to bring people together, not to divide people. He tried to bring people together. And that was best illustrated with, when the Aus and the Khazraj, they approached the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to do what? To deal with their problems of division. Fundamentally, this was two tribes that were at war with each other for decades, to the point that they fought over something as stupid as a dispute over a camel for 30 years. And they approached the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and said, look, okay, this is getting out of hand. Can you bring us together? And that's exactly what the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam did. He removed the differences between the two tribes, united the hearts of the people. Equally, if you look at once the state was established in Medina, and the hijrah was made, and the muhajir who left Makkah, left their families, left their wealth, left their homes, they came to Medina. And what did the Prophet ﷺ encourage the people to do? To offer them, so he turned to the people of Medina and said, to offer them a place to stay. The people of Medina even offered the women folk in marriage to the muhajirin. In order to what? Again, to bring down barriers, in order to create a unity, a sense of brotherhood, a sense of belonging. And fundamentally, as I've kind of mentioned, this was one of the key characteristics of the messengership and the prophethood of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and is something that the Sahaba themselves carried forward after the death of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Jazakallah khair, brother. Very enlightening answer. Jazakallah. Samad, would you just briefly?
We talked a little bit about nationalism and things like this. I just wanted to quote a hadith of
the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Yes. And it says, he who calls for asabiyya, i.e. nationalism, or fights for asabiyya, or dies for asabiyya, is not one of us. This is Abu Dawud. And so we need to understand, Islam is not built upon nationalism, color, race, anything like that. It's built upon, and what's important for us to realize is that before the establishment of this Islamic society, this was the culture that was delivered to the people, where the mindset was fixed before we had a society that could reflect all this culture and these values. So really, for us, the challenge is that we need to challenge some of these, values that are dominant at the moment, which is actually the cause of the problem, and which is then reflected in the systems, the laws, the practices of the society. And inshallah, very soon, we will have the Islamic Khilafah system, where we will truly reflect and truly demonstrate to the whole world how we can bring people of different color, different race, and different creed together in harmony. Inshallah.
Jazakallah khair, brother. Listeners, thank you for listening to our show. I hope I've learnt a lot. I hope you have learnt a few things from the show. Mashallah, it's been very interesting. For our non-Muslim counterparts, please, as the guests have advised us, that we should contemplate and look into Islam. This is something, inshallah, we advise that you look into, because only through Islam you can solve these problems of nationalism and tribalism and black and white issue. And for the Muslims, inshallah, I'm sure you will also look into the point of establishing Khilafah, and to think and contemplate on how Khilafah can be established. So, and a special thanks to our both of the contributors. Jazakallah for coming to the show, and a big thank you to all of you for listening. You can also continue with the discussion, inshallah, on Twitter at Middle Path Radio. Until next time, Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.